The Gulf War lasted from August 2, 1990 to January 17, 1991. However, U.S. involvement in the war, Operation Desert Storm, only lasted for a total of 43 days. This short timeline, however, had a massive impact on both the U.S. and the Middle Eastern regions. What were these impacts and how did it begin? During the Cold War from 1947 to 1991, Iraq was allied with the Soviet Union. The U.S. and Iraq had a history of friction, including their previous Cold War stances, as well as Iraqi support for Palestinian militant groups. In 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, was formed by the 5 founding countries, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, to coordinate and unify petroleum policies. On September 22, 1980, the Iran-Iraq War began. Initially, the U.S. stayed neutral, providing supplies and resources to Iraq. As the war progressed, the U.S. increased their support for Iraq to prevent a forced surrender from Iran. To the Reagan administration, an Iranian victory would further anti-American Iranian Supreme Leader Ruhollah Khomeini's aim of exporting Islamic revolution throughout the Middle East and thus destabilizing local monarchies, a threat to the Gulf oil that the U.S. depended on. To other Middle Eastern countries, Iran was getting too powerful and therefore a danger to the region. After the ceasefire was signed on July 20, 1988, Iraq had racked up high debts to other countries, most notably the rich but militarily weak Kuwait. Iraq's leader at the time, Saddam Hussein, argued that the debts should be forgiven for Iraq's protection of the Arabian Peninsula, which Kuwait refused to accept. Territorial disputes also added to the growing tensions. The United Kingdom drew the line between Iraq and Kuwait but ended its protectorate over Kuwait in 1961. The Iraqi Prime Minister of the time asserted that Kuwait was part of Iraq, since it had been part of the former Ottoman Empire. Finally, Iraq also accused Kuwait of exceeding its OPEC regulations and overproducing, depressing prices and depriving Iraq of critical oil revenues. Iraq also accused Kuwait of slant drilling into Iraq's Rumaila oil field, which was on the border. During this time, Iraq accused the U.S. and Israel of deliberately weakening Iraq by encouraging Kuwait to reduce oil prices, deteriorating relations with the U.S. When Iraq began threatening Kuwait, the U.S. warned Iraq against taking military action against Kuwait and the UAE. These rising tensions led to the Jeddah talks between Iraq and Kuwait. Iraq demanded $10 billion in compensation for slant drilling into their oil fields, but Kuwait only offered $500 million for damages. In response, Iraq invaded Kuwait.
The coalition, Kuwait's allies, included countries like Australia, France, and the U.S. At the same time, the president of the U.S. was George H.W. Bush, and the president of Iraq was Saddam Hussein. Operation Desert Storm began with American air and missile attacks in Iraq and Kuwait. As a response to U.S. attacks, Iraq retaliated with Scud missile strikes, one of a series of warheads developed by the Soviet Union, on Israel and Saudi Arabia. On January 22, 1991, Iraq torched Kuwaiti oil wells and tanks after scattering prisoners of war as shields at Allied air targets. Despite the U.S. victory, during the war, after only 11 days of fighting, more than 75,000 protesters gathered in Washington, D.C. in an anti-war demonstration. Although there was widespread dissent about the war at the time, in a poll taken in 2001, it was recorded that 63% of Americans believed that U.S. involvement was necessary in the Gulf War.
During the time span of the Gulf War, hundreds of Palestinians migrated out of Kuwait as a result of intimidation from Iraqi military occupation and food shortages. Of 350,000 Palestinians living in Kuwait, more than 200,000 fled, dropping their population to less than a quarter of what it was originally. Many returning coalition soldiers from Operation Desert Storm reported illnesses following their action in war, a phenomenon known as Gulf War syndrome or Gulf War illness. Common symptoms that were reported are chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, widespread pain, sleep issues, mental and emotional distress, and gastrointestinal disorder. 2 years later, in 1993, the Regal Report was released. Although never confirmed, the Regal Report, written by Senator Regal, claimed that there was evidence that U.S. veterans had come into chemical attacks during the Gulf War. He did not claim that Iraq had used chemical weapons, but rather hinted at that possibility and urged the U.S. Department of Defense to continue investigating the matter. This would be corroborated by Iraq's use of chemical weapons and human rights violations during the Iran-Iraq War and further increase the lasting tensions between Iraq and the US. However, other studies done after the Regal report was published hinted that these illnesses were normal byproducts of war and not something attributed to special chemical weapons.
On September 11, 2011, terrorists hijacked planes that targeted the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and possibly the White House, killing 2,996 people. They didn't want any Western influence and disliked Western support against some Muslim groups, so they found it their religious mission to attack America. This attack is one of the most remembered events in U.S. history, greatly changing security and defense, such as new airport security. President George W. Bush started the war on terror after 9/11 to end the terrorist groups that attacked the U.S. and later overthrew Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq with whom the United States had problems with. He balked at the agreements he had signed at the end of the Gulf War and refused to permit international inspectors to examine military sites in his country. Accused of harboring weapons of mass destruction to use against the U.S., his control of Iraq collapsed under U.S. attack. Soon after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the start of the Iraq War, on March 19th and 20th, Hussein disappeared from the public eye and went into hiding. Throughout 2003, the U.S. commenced the largest manhunt in history, carrying out many unsuccessful missions to capture Hussein. After capturing Hussein's right-hand man, the U.S. finally obtained enough information to pinpoint his location. The U.S. then commenced Operation Red Dawn, and he was captured by U.S. forces on December 13, 2003. He was sentenced to death by the Iraqi Special Tribunal and executed on December 30, 2006. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait led to the adoption of economic sanctions to be placed on Iraq by the UN Security Council. The agreement was titled Resolution 661, and it was decided that the states were to withdraw economic interactions with Iraq and Kuwait.
The U.S. continues its presence in the Middle East, met often with pushback. The resistance to U.S. meddling in the Middle East provides motivations for terrorist attacks on the country, including the terrorist attacks of September 11th and the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings. Nearly 224 people died in the U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. This terrorist attack was directly connected to Al-Qaeda, the same terrorist group behind the 9/11 attacks. Terrorist attacks from Islamic militant groups like Al-Qaeda continue to be a concern today. But would the U.S. have interfered in the conflict between Kuwait and Iraq if they weren't leading global producers for oil? A U.S. official said in 1991 that if Kuwait, Saudi Arabia's principal export were oranges, a mid-level State Department official would have issued a statement and we would have closed down Washington for August. The U.S. is the number one consumer of oil globally and by a large margin. This was probably the primary reason for their involvement in the Gulf War in an effort to maintain low oil prices. However, U.S. intervention didn't have its intended effect. Instead, OPEC became more fractured and unstable. Global gas prices drastically increased after the war, since two major oil-producing countries were devastated. This also caused a shift in global attention from OPEC oil to an interest in formerly Soviet Union oil, which has been reflected in the impacts of the current Ukrainian war. There has also been a call for regulation of the international oil market. Operation Desert Storm marked a major change in U.S. policy, especially towards Iran, from mainly indirect support of allies to direct involvement and presence. Despite the Gulf War only lasting a total of 43 days and not even U.S. territories, the impacts of the war greatly changed the people, foreign relations, and ideologies of the U.S.